everybody, Mike here with Delta Faucet. Today I'm going to show you how to install the Delta Faucet R11000, a 3 and 6 setting diverter rough for a shower. The Delta Faucet R11000 diverter rough is compatible with any 3 or 6 setting Delta custom shower diverter trim and is paired with a Delta Faucet multi-choice R10000 rough valve. Now if you need help installing that rough valve, we do have a video for that too, so be sure to check that out. Now today's project assumes you already have the multi-choice R10000 valve in place. Now this R11000 diverter is great and allows you to have up to 6 different combinations of water from up to 3 different outlets. So for example, if you wanted to have a rain can shower head, a handheld shower, and a standard shower head, this separate diverter allows for just that, while also giving you more flexibility on where to install it since it's not integrated into your handle trim. This R11000 diverter is a perfect solution for creating that perfect custom shower experience. Now typically you'd only be tackling this project if you're doing a bathroom remodel that's been taken all the way down to studs, or you're doing new construction. Now if you're tackling a project that complicated, I'm guessing you already have some DIY experience. But just keep in mind that every install is unique and building codes are different everywhere. So if you run into an issue or there are any steps that you're uncomfortable with, I definitely recommend bringing in the help of a professional. But if you feel good with it, let's get started. For our installation today, you'll need a power screwdriver, screws, and we recommend between a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch screws to ensure you don't go through the wall, construction screws, a tape measure, a level, a pencil. You may need either a circular saw or jigsaw, or both, for your installation, safety goggles or glasses, and then whatever plumbing is appropriate for your water supply. Now, we're going to be using PEX for our water supplies, but you can use copper, galvanized iron, PEX, or even CPVC. Okay. Grab those tools and supplies, and let's get started. All right, so here we are inside of our rough framing. Now the first thing I want to do is determine the position of the R11000 diverter valve. Now you notice I've already got my multi-choice valve installed here, and when it comes to positioning the diverter valve, there's really no rules about exactly where this needs to go. But there are 3 things I want you to think of. The first is overall how you want the shower to function, where you want that diverter handle to be placed. Second, it also helps to maybe think about the final finish covering. If you're using like a large format tile, you want to make sure that diverter valve falls in the middle of that tile, just think about where that might need to be. And then lastly, I want you to remember that you're going to have a trim around both of the diverter valve and your multi-choice valve down here at the bottom. So you want to make sure you place those far enough apart that that finished trim won't interfere with each other. All right, once you've got the general position determined, and in my case, I'm going to have it centered above my multi-choice valve and probably right about in here somewhere. The next thing you want to do is determine how far back the blocking needs to be installed. Now the important dimension to remember here is 2 3/4 inches off finished wall. I'm going to say that again, finished wall, because that means you have to think about what your wall covering is going to be off of your framing here. Now in my case, I'm going to be having 1/2 inch of cement board on here and then another 1/2 inch of tile and thin set. So my finished wall dimension is actually going to be 1 inch off of my framing. That means that my blocking needs to be 1 3/4 inches back from the face of my framing here. So what I'm going to do is take my tape measure. I'm going to make a quick reference mark at about 1 3/4 inches back from the face of my framing here. Same thing on the other side where I want that positioned. All right, now I know that's where the face of my blocking between my 2 framing members here is going to sit. So when I've got those positions marked, I'm going to go ahead and install that blocking. All right, so I have my blocking cut to size to fit perfectly in between my 2 studs here. Next, I'm going to go ahead and add a couple screws on each side, making sure I'm keeping it perfectly level from side to side. Then again, I can make a final check at this point just to confirm that I've got my blocking at the correct depth back from my finished wall. Okay, everything's looking great. We can move on. Now that we have our blocking in place, it's now time to mount our diverter valve in its final position. Now there's a couple things I want to point out before we do this. The first is, on the valve, you'll notice that there's a section that says up. Now when I mount this, I want to make sure that is facing up, obviously. Second, the input side of the diverter valve is always from the bottom. So when I'm mounting this, I want to make sure that my bottom connection is the one that's going to be connected to my multi-choice valve, or the source of the water. And then finally, there's 3 outputs on the top, the left, and the right side. Now, if you're using the 3-function diverter valve, that means you only have 2 fixtures attached to it. Now, that might be, say, a shower head and a rain can. Now, in that case, I would make sure I connected those 2 fixtures to the up and left sides and cap the right side. It's very important if you're only using the 3-function diverter that we're always capping the right side. Now, in my case, I'm using the 6-function diverter. That means I'm going to have 3 different fixtures attached: a shower head, a rain can, and a hand shower. So I can go ahead and remove this little tag off to the side and then mount my diverter valve. Now again, I think I mentioned earlier that I'm going to mount my diverter valve exactly centered over my multi-choice valve here. So I've marked a center line here. I'm going to hold it in place right about where it looks good, and then use 2 screws through those little mounting holes at the top to hold it tight in place. Okay, that looks great. Ready to move on. All right, now that we have our diverter valve in its final location, it's time to make our plumbing connections. Now, there's a couple of things I want to talk about before doing this, though. The first is I always like having my diverter valve in its final location before making those connections, because it helps me go ahead and measure to make sure all my pipe lanes are going to be perfect, to make sure it stays right where I want it. Second, to make some of these connections, you may need to loosen up those 2 screws and maybe even pull the diverter valve off the wall to make sure you're getting everything nice and watertight. All right, so one thing I want to point out is that I'm connecting the output side of my multi-choice valve to the input side of my diverter valve. And again, the input side is the bottom of the valve itself. Secondly, I want to make sure I'm connecting all my fixtures to the left, the top, and the right side of my diverter valve here. And then lastly, if there's any soldering you're going to be doing around the diverter valve, I want to make sure I'm removing my test cap and my bonnet nut and sliding those off to the side for safekeeping to make sure those don't get damaged while I'm doing those connections. All right, I'm going to go ahead and make all my plumbing connections, and then we'll be about ready to pressure test our system. All right, now that I've got my plumbing installed, it's time to do some final checks. The first thing I want to check is to make sure my diverter valve is tight to my blocking so it's not going to wiggle around at all. Secondly, I'm just going to make sure everything looks nice and level, which it does. And I also think it's a good idea now to do one last visual inspection of all your connection points to make sure all your connections look nice. And then finally, I also like to check to make sure my test cap, my bonnet nut are securely in place. Everything's looking pretty good here, so what we're going to do now is go ahead and pressure test the system, and I'm just going to check all my connection points to see if I have any leaks anywhere. And that about wraps it up for the R11000 Diverter Rough. All right, I hope everything went well with that install, and if you have any additional questions, you can always reach out to Delta Faucet's customer service team. They're more than happy to help.